Okay, so as I said, I'm thrilled to be joined by Nancy Lowe this evening, who's a local wildlife gardener and is going to be sharing her expertise. But before I hand over to Nancy, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Stepping Stones project that I work on. We've got a few new faces tonight, so it might be that some of you aren't that familiar with the project. So I just thought I'd give you a bit of background and explain why the Stepping Stones project is hosting this evening's webinar on wildlife gardening. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? I get a few nods. Yep, great. So as I said, I work for the National Trust, and the project that I work on is called Stepping Stones. And here on the screen, you can see our project vision. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll read it out. So it's a 50-year vision, and it's for the natural habitats in the Shropshire Hills to be restored, healthy and connected, and the people who live, work and visit there to understand, appreciate and support our combined efforts to rejuvenate this remarkable landscape. So as I said, that's quite a mouthful, and I'll unpick that for you in the next few slides. So this is the project area. You can see it stretches from Church Stretton in the east all the way across the Longmynd over to the Stiperstones and up to Pontesbury in the north, and not quite to Bishop's Castle in the southwest. So this is the area that I tend to work in for the Stepping Stones project. The boundary is a little bit fuzzy, so we're not too strict about that, but this just gives you an impression of the area that my project is focused on, and it's 200 square kilometres, so a sizable chunk of the South Shropshire Hills. It's a partnership project currently led by the National Trust, but involving various other partners, and you can see those listed there on the left. So the project in a nutshell, I suppose, focuses on two core areas for nature within the project area, and thinks about the landscape around them and in between them. So we've got the Longmynd here, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. That's owned and managed by the National Trust and the commoners, and it's a really important upland site for nature in the area. And if you look from the top of the Mynd across the valley, 5 or 6 miles, you'll find the Stiperstones. Again, I'm sure many of you know these well. But the Stiperstones, of course, a national nature reserve and owned and managed by Natural England. So these are the two core sites for conservation for nature within the project area. And the overall aim of the Stepping Stones project is really to think about how these two areas can be linked up for wildlife over the years. As I'll come on to it in a second, they've become ecologically isolated, I suppose, cut off from each other, and Stepping Stones hopes to help link them up again. So what's the problem? Why do we need a project like Stepping Stones? Well, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the landscape of the UK as a whole, and the South Shropshire Hills is no exception, has undergone a period of landscape change really in the last century. That includes quite a lot of habitat loss. So we've lost things like hedgerows, small woodlands, meadows, upland areas as well, generally due to changes in the way that the land is farmed, but also pressures like climate change and other things as well. So as well as a change in the landscape and loss of habitat, we've also got a loss of connectivity. And I'm just going to read out this quote from the left because it sums it up quite nicely. This is taken from the Flora of Shropshire, which was published in 2015. So the authors of that Flora said, "There appears to be increasing polarisation between conservation-rich and conservation-poor areas, and an overall weakening of the ecological network." So what they meant by that really is that nature reserves are not enough. We've got these small areas that are great for nature, but they're increasingly isolated and cut off in the landscape. You can see on this picture the background is actually quite nicely connected, lots of hedgerows, lots of infield trees and things like that. But in the foreground and on top of some of the hills, it's the opposite really. They've lost that connectivity, and they're not really sort of working for wildlife in the way that maybe they used to. So what are we going to do about this? Well, the aim of stepping stones is to connect up existing wildlife habitats by strengthening and creating stepping stones or patches of habitat, and linking them with corridors. And the area that we're focusing on, as I've said, is between the Longmynd and Stretton Hills in the east over to the Stiper Stones in the west. And this diagram sort of illustrates that, I suppose. So on here, we've got in green these two core areas. We've got the Longmynd down here, Stiper Stones up here. And in between, we've got some patches of habitat, so these small circles. And some of those patches might be joined up into wildlife corridors. And these could also be linear features, things like hedgerows and road verges. And then we've got some areas of habitat creation where we're trying to create those new core areas for wildlife. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an indication of the overall aims of the project. Now, the habitats that we're particularly focusing on, and some of these are more relevant to gardening than others, but wildflower-rich grassland or meadow habitat, that's a really key habitat for us. In the UK, we've lost about 97% of our meadow habitat in the last century, so really key habitat for us, and fantastic for wildlife. And the linking feature for meadows is a little bit unexpected, really, but road verges. So when they're managed correctly, road verges can be seen as long linear meadows. And our vision is for patches of meadow to be linked up by these beautiful flower-rich road verges. Woodland is another habitat that we're focusing on. And of course, the linking feature for patches of woodland is hedgerow. Wetland is another target habitat for us, linked by streamside wetlands. And heathland, not so much linked up, but really buffered by something called frith, which is a Welsh word for upland fringe habitat, really. So often on steep slopes, characterised by gorse and scrub. So the key messages, really, as I've said, it's a 50-year vision. The project will help wildlife, importantly, reduce carbon and store carbon, and also help people as well. And we are taking quite an innovative landscape scale approach to this, working in partnership beyond the boundaries of National Trust land. And the people we're working with are very diverse. We're working with farmers, local communities, local volunteers, and existing community groups to restore and create these stepping stones and wildlife corridors. And this is needed, of course, because, as I've mentioned, the landscape of the Shropshire Hills is changing and much of its characteristic wildlife is in decline. And the final, and maybe the most important message, and the one that links into our webinar tonight, is that we really believe that anyone can help make a difference. And the key thing is to make their garden a stepping stone for wildlife. So just going back to this diagram, if you're sort of wondering how your garden might fit into all this, and all these little individual dots or patches of habitat or stepping stones, these could be individual gardens. And if you imagine if all the gardens in South Shropshire were wildlife rich, then that would be a fantastic asset, and it would really, really make a difference to the wildlife that we're trying to help and protect. So that's it from me, just that brief introduction there. If you've got any other questions about stepping stones, we might have time at the end, but I'm conscious that this is a webinar about wildlife gardening, so I want to move on to that as quickly as possible. But hopefully that just sets the context and maybe inspires you to view your garden, not just as an area for yourself and your family, but also as a stepping stone for wildlife. So I'm going to stop sharing that now and hand over to Nancy.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you. That was great to hear some more about the project. Okay, so let's move on to talking about the nub of the meeting here tonight. We've got I've got all sorts of things that I want to share with you all. Let's get the screen sharing up. I put together a PowerPoint as well, so if I can get that one up on the screen. This one. Let's see. Okay. So yes, so I'd love to talk to you all tonight about wildlife gardening, and this is a talk about gardening rather than particularly wildlife gardens. So I've been working as a wildlife gardener for a while now. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself in a moment, but before I do, I would like to find out if there are any particularly burning questions that any of you are coming to this talk with, because I really would like to make sure that I cover topics that are very useful to you. I'm going to be covering quite a broad spread. So if anybody is here with a burning question, if you could type that up into the chat. So remember, the chat's should be at the bottom of your screen if you move your mouse. If you don't have any burning questions, don't worry about it, just leave this. If you can pop those up now, Charlie will keep an eye out on what you're typing in there, and I'll come back and check through this list and just point out to you where that's going to come in. And if there's anything that I don't manage to cover through the talk, then there will be an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. Okay, so you can type something in there, wonderful. First of all, while you're typing any questions in, I'll tell you a little bit about some backgrounds about me. So, as I said, I'm a gardener, been specialising in wildlife gardens, really due to my background. Before I became a gardener, my training was in environmental science, and most of my degree sort of focused on ecology and conservation management, and I love this subject. I find it really, really fascinating, finding out about how all the sort of plants and animals interact with each other to make functioning systems. So I love to draw on that for my gardening style and to bring that sort of understanding to the way that I put gardens together and the way that I think about plant choices and arranging things within a garden. So I draw on that with my gardening. But so since getting into gardening, I've always had quite a strong aesthetic. I've got a bit of a design background previous to my degree, and I always like to make things look good. So I really do like to create beautiful gardens. I work now as a gardener and a garden designer, and I love to create beautiful gardens that people love to spend time in, but that are also quite functional ecologically. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with everything, to give you a little bit of an idea about it. So that's a bit about me and my gardening style, but I really want to talk about gardening and you, and making sure that what we cover here is very relevant to you. So Charlie, is there anything that's come up in the chat? Have we got any burning questions, or is everybody just happy to?
Just a first question really about how can we best use water for wildlife, especially in a semi-urban area?
Lovely. Okay. Yes, we're going to be covering, if I put up the contents page for you to see, these are the topics that we're going to be covering. So yes, we will get onto water within the features section. So if everyone was asking that question, if you sort of keep a lookout in there, I try to cover a good range of different ways that we're going to be using water in that section there. But again, ask up if there's anything that I didn't specifically cover to ask in the questions. Anything else, Charlie, or?
An interesting one that I sympathise with, ideas for plants and shrubs that are good for wildlife, but unlikely to cause hay fever.
Okay. Okay, that's a bit of a tricky one. I'm going to definitely come up with some ideas for plants and shrubs that we can use that are good for wildlife in a few different ways. Yeah, I'm a hay fever sufferer as well. Great one if you're a gardener. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover that one, I'm afraid, but I hope to give you some really good ideas with plants that you can use that are good for wildlife at least. But yeah, that's an interesting one. I might have to look into that one, so thank you for that.
And another one, yeah, I'll read this out, it's a little bit longer. Sarah says, my garden is overgrown and not necessarily as wildlife friendly as it could be. At the same time, I need some low intervention solutions since I also look after pasture and an old building too. Can you suggest approaches for a space that is south facing, can be dry in summer, gets very wet in winter? I have a pond, but fed by a stream, it can be very wet in winter and relatively dry in summer. So I think a garden there that's sort of quite extreme in the conditions it's experiencing.
Yeah. Okay. So again, in the features section, we're going to be talking about plant choices. And I do concentrate a lot. Working as a gardener, I'm quite aware that people have different amounts of time available for gardening. So I'm going to be talking about making sure to keep things so they're lower maintenance. If you've got lots of garden and pasture and other things to look after, I can definitely talk about how to make things easier to manage. And we're going to be talking about, in the principles section, we're going to be talking about making sure to make good plant choices for the environment that you've got. So hopefully I'll be able to draw that in that section for you.
And a final one, Nancy, on slug control. So I guess eco-friendly pest control options.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, again, in the features section, we're going to be talking about that sort of thing. Lovely. Okay, thank you. So I'll try and bear all those in mind as we go along. Let's get started. Okay, so yes, so we're going to be talking about, as I say, it's wildlife gardening. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about gardening itself and gardening style. And I do really want to draw out for you how to approach wildlife gardening depending on your personal style, because we all approach gardens in very different ways. So we'll talk about that to start with. And then I really like to prioritise things. So we're going to talk about some underlying principles to think about in all wildlife gardens that apply in all cases. Then we're going to talk about some features. And as we go through, we're going to be talking about how to select features that suit your gardening style and suit your skill level in gardening, and drawing everything back together into this whole sort of idea of relationship, and that the garden is all about relationship between those ecological elements and also between you and your garden. So sort of drawing it together at the end with that. Okay. So thank you for all the questions, but I would love to know a little bit more about you before we get going, and what level of gardening ability we have here, because it's the types of features that you can fit into a wildlife garden are partly dependent on the level of gardening skill that you've got. And as we go through the talk, I'm going to be highlighting any points where there are particular skills that you need to be able to make those features really work. There are some things that are really easy for beginners to do, some things that take a little bit more skill and may need a little bit of research if you're a beginner gardener to do that. So I believe, Charlie, is there a poll that we can launch? Okay, I'm hoping you can all see this on the screen. So we've got, what level of gardening ability do you have? Are you a beginner, an intermediate, or an experienced? So if you can click on this poll, it'd be great to just find out where we all are with this. And I tend to think, for me, it tends to feel like this all to do with your plant knowledge, really. If you've got lots of plant knowledge, maybe you know about lifting and dividing plants, you feel quite confident pruning, you're quite an experienced gardener, you know how to handle all the sorts of things a garden could throw your way. Perhaps you know lots about identifying pest problems. If you're an intermediate gardener, you're going to have some idea about those things. And if you're a beginner, you're perhaps not going to know what I'm talking about when it comes to lifting and dividing plants, and you don't feel confident to set to work on some shrubs. So good to see what sort of level we've got going on there. So if you can fill in the poll there, that'd be brilliant. And thank you so much, everybody, for sharing this information and letting me get to know you all a little bit more. It's good to build up a bit of a picture as we go through this. Is that coming through, Charlie? I'm not sure how this works. Brilliant. Okay. Oh, we've got very even spread. So, yeah, a good chunk of beginners and a good chunk of experienced gardeners too. Good. Okay, lovely. All right. So, yes, as I say, there are different features for different levels of ability as we go through. So I will try to make that quite clear as we're going through. Okay. Let's get started then talking about gardening. So if we think about gardening, essentially the act of going out into your garden is the act of you relating to your garden and all the beings that live outside your back door. This is basically what's going on. And it often comes down to a question of how much control you want to have over those beings that live in your back door. And I find that this is hugely variable for people. It is a really personal relationship. Some people, when they look out into their garden, they just see glory in the wonder of all the things that arrive by themselves, and and they find great joy in seeing new plants popping up and not knowing what's going to be there, not knowing what's going to come up this year, new seeded plants, where things are going to move, which plants are going to thrive and how things are going to grow. Whereas for other people, that's actually very, very stressful. They look outside the window and they see plants seeding in, or other plants kind of getting into each other and getting in the way of each other, and that's very, very stressful. It's a really personal thing, how we look at our gardens. And I think going out as a gardener, as a wildlife gardener, I expected people to think of wildlife gardens exactly how I do, but I found quite the opposite, really. And I'm very keen, I've always been really keen to do my gardens in a way that my clients really want and that makes them feel comfortable. And I so often find it is down to this idea of how much control you have over your garden. And that's all to do with how we're relating to the things that are outside. And I like to think of it in terms of this wildness spectrum. How wild are you prepared to let your garden, or how much do you want to be in control and be taming the plants that are out there and controlling what comes into the garden? So have a think during this section about where you sit on this wildness spectrum. At the beginning, we have what I would call a sort of tamed natural beauty. And this is a traditional shape of garden. So you're going to have traditional beds and borders, lots of flowering perennial plants, which you can put in all sorts of wonderful plants for pollinators into beds and borders, a lovely splash of colour. You're going to be using more traditional garden plants, traditional sort of shrubs and trees. And again, there are some fantastic wildlife choices you can make. I'll be talking about these sorts of details later, but they're going to be trees that behave, they're more well behaved, that aren't going to be seeding around, so perhaps not so much the native trees and shrubs, but certainly lots of the cultivated ones that can be clipped neatly and kept under control. So that's at the sort of the tamer end of the spectrum. Going a little bit wilder, we've got the sort of intermediate things where you're going to be taking some control over it, but you're going to be letting it run wild a little bit. So these are features like a meadow. A meadow is a classic one, where you seed in your meadow seed, and for a good part of the year, you're really taking control. You're cutting it back, you're keeping it short. It's almost like a garden lawn. It's not as neat as a pure grass one, but it's kept pretty short and tidy. But from sort of April onwards, you're going to be letting that grow wild, and you're not going to be deciding what plant pops up where. You're going to be letting it do its own thing. So it's a lovely mixture between being in charge, but also letting the wildness come in. And other features that sort of fit into this intermediate category are things like a native hedge, where you've got some lovely native plants that are wonderful for insects, but you can keep it clipped nice and neatly. It doesn't need to look too wild. It can still look, quite like a traditional garden would. A woodland garden or a prairie garden are other examples. Different types of habitats, perhaps woodland garden, you've got some lovely mature trees in there. But underneath it, you're carefully choosing the plants so you can have a more flower-rich understory than you might have if you just had trees and just let them go wild and let the understory decide for itself what was coming in there. So you can really choose some beautiful spring flowers and fill the ground with all sorts of lovely colour and structural plants. A prairie garden, we're going to be coming back to this later, but prairie gardens are a wonderful example of a traditional bed and border, but you're choosing your plants. One of the main things you're choosing your plants for is for winter structure. You have plants that hold a beautiful shape, beautiful seed heads right the way through the winter, and providing fantastic winter stems for those insects, but without perhaps the messiness of beds and borders that are left wild through the winter months. They're great for insects, but don't necessarily look as attractive. So if you do have a need for your garden to look beautiful year round, then both the woodland garden and prairie garden options are really great ones for you in this middle section. And as the note at the bottom of the screen there says, this does take a certain degree of skill. So if you're good with your plant knowledge and you have skills such as lifting and dividing plants and for looking after those prairie plants, and you've got some good plant knowledge for putting in your sort of woodland plants and berry plants, then that's a really great one for you. Or it's perhaps something to develop some knowledge about. And I've got some handouts coming up at the end One of them is all about prairie plants. So I've got some lovely suggestions if you want to include that into your garden. Let's move on to our fully wild garden. So at the other end of this spectrum, I suspect there'll be a few of you who have patches of your garden where it's like this. And some of you may be really happy about it. Some of you may not be so happy about it. People have wildly varying opinions about this sort of garden, but the fully wild gardens where you let everything go wild can be fantastic for wildlife. They can provide brilliant habitat for small mammals and for birds and all sorts of insects. Trees that are allowed to grow, if you've got enough space for it, to their full height, otherwise smaller trees that are allowed to grow to their full height. When you let gardens go completely wild, if it's a new garden, you're often finding you might end up with nettle patches or bramble patches. And people feel different ways about these things. They can be fantastic for wildlife. They're really, really valuable habitats. And if you let those go, eventually you're going to get saplings coming through and small trees growing. Maybe you have an old mature garden and you've already got some mature trees, in which case you might find the understory is much more well behaved. You might find there's some lovely dense ivy growing through there, and it actually looks rather attractive. Maybe some spring flowers are coming through as well, some sort of lovely wildflowers under those trees. So this is a sort of less interventionalist type of garden. Great for the beginner because it doesn't take a lot of work to have a fully wild garden. All you need is perhaps to mow some paths through it, to put some seating in, perhaps the use of some shears or brush cutter to sort of clip back all the thorny scrub to make a patch. So yeah, as I say, they're great for some types of wildlife, not so great for pollinators often right the way through the year. Those perennial borders in a tame garden are fantastic for pollinators, whereas this wild garden is better for things like small mammals and perhaps birds too, because of all the trees that you have there. So there are benefits to either end of this spectrum, and that's what I want to make really clear is wherever you sit on this spectrum, whatever you're thinking about what I'm saying about all these different types of garden, there are benefits to wildlife. And as we go through the further sections of this talk, I'm going to explain to you about how each of these types of garden, each of these types of approaches to your garden and how you relate to it are fantastic. And there are fantastic things you can do at every point on this spectrum to look after the wildlife in your garden. So again, I'd like to go back to you and find out a little bit about you and about where your comfort zone is on this wildness spectrum. It could be that you're definitely at one end or the other or in the middle of this spectrum. It could be that you've got a few different points on the spectrum that you like to integrate into your garden, or that you would like to integrate into your garden you're not doing already, but perhaps you'd like to have a bit more wild, or perhaps you'd like to have a bit more neat. So I've put up a number of different options on this poll. But just have a think. This is for yourself, really, to have a think. As I go through the talk, I'm going to be drawing out these different types of gardening and talking about different techniques that are appropriate for these different styles, different ways of relating. So we've got tamed natural beauty, tame and part wild on its own, part wild and fully wild, just fully wild, or all three. I've got to be honest, all those pictures are from my garden. I do all three. I quite like to do them all. I'm quite lucky in having enough space to do that. So have a think. As we go through the features, I'm going to try and draw out all sorts of different techniques you can use for all these different types of gardening. But your garden is your own thing. So it's got to be, we're talking about gardens as a relationship between you and what's outside, and you've got to be happy with that relationship. So it's good to be really honest with yourself about your comfort factor, not to feel pushed towards having a very wild garden that perhaps it just feels too messy to you. If you feel more comfortable with a tidy garden, that's wonderful. You can do some beautiful things with a tidy garden. And likewise, don't feel bad about having a tidy garden and feel that's not wild enough. It definitely is. Okay, so are the results in, or shall I give everybody a little bit longer? Here we go. Right, so not so much on the tamed natural beauty. I think the winner is tame and part wild. yeah, it is really nice to mix approaches. We've got no complete fully wilds, but we've got a few of all of the above. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, lovely. So let's go through and see what some of our options are. Seems to take a little while to come back to when we drop these polls. Here we go. Thank you for that, everybody. Okay, so section 2, let's have a look at some of these underlying principles. So as I said, there are some things that are really sort of foundational to having a wildlife garden, and I've picked out my 3 top principles really. So whatever you're going to do in your garden, do these 3 things. The first one, the most important thing I would say for anyone, for any garden actually, but for any wildlife garden in particular, is health. To have a healthy wildlife garden, you've got to have a good healthy garden. Everything's got to be thriving. If you've got really good healthy plants, then all the other organisms that move into your garden, that come there, are going to have a really nice sort of base of healthy, nutritious food. And there's really, it's quite simple how to get a healthy garden. The main things that you need are healthy plants and healthy soil. Now, the number one thing that you need to know for healthy plants is what's written underneath that title, healthy plants. It's right plant, right place. And this is the thing that I see so often that isn't right, is plants being put in the wrong place. So getting onto that subject of the, whoever it was who had the really dry soil through the summer, was it, and really wet in the winter. Yeah, we do have difficulties with that in Shropshire. It's a really heavy clay soil here, which can bake really, really hard in the summer, can be really difficult to work with. And equally in the winter, it just doesn't let that moisture through. So any beds that you're making, I definitely recommend to improve the soil with some compost, either work some in or put down compost mulches anywhere where you've got bare soil. So really improve your soil and look after your soil. That's really, really important. Because most plants like a moisture retentive but well-drained soil. So we're lucky that we've got the clay here, because you can have a really good moisture retentive soil with clay. It's more difficult on a sandy soil, but you do need to add some good compost to that. The other thing to think about, apart from your soil conditions, is sun conditions. And this is another really, unfortunately, misunderstood part of plant labelling. So whenever you're buying plants, do check those plant labels. Really get to know your garden and where your beds are in your garden, and where you intend to put beds, and really notice how much sun those parts of the garden are getting. One of the things, those of you who are experienced, this is going to be very familiar to you, but anybody who's slightly newer to gardening, the key thing to know about the sun levels that are on the labels, they always have these little icons. You'll have either a white sun, or a sun that's half white, half black, or a sun that's all black, or it may say full sun, which is that white sun, part sun or part shade, which is that half black, half white, and full shade, which is the little black sun. And they have very specific meanings. So the full sun label means that that plant, the surface of those leaves of that plant, is getting direct sunlight directly from the sun on it for at least 6 hours of the day. A part sun, part shade, so half black, half white, that is getting direct sun onto the plant for between 3 and 6 hours of the day. And the little black sun is getting direct sun onto the plant for 3 or less hours of the day. So a lot of people misunderstand and think that if it's in full shade, that it's not getting any direct sun onto it at all. It can be getting full sun for a part of the day, and it is still classed as a full shade plant. So it's all to do with the amount of time during the day that the plant's getting the sun onto it. So that's a really common misconception that I come across. So sorry to bang on about that, perhaps in quite a lot of detail for those of you that's very familiar to. But it's so important. Plants really can't thrive if they've got the wrong amount of sunlight levels, and they'll become quite sickly. So yeah, so right plant, right place. Really do read those labels, find out what conditions plants need. There are some beautiful plants that really need a very moist, very wet type of garden that unfortunately most of us can't put in our gardens because we don't have those very boggy conditions. And likewise, there are some plants that love a really, really free draining soil. and they will not thrive in our heavy clay soil. The only way to get around that is to build raised beds and put in some soil work with grit and good amount of compost worked in to keep it free draining, for most of us anyway. Okay, so right plant, right place. Healthy soil, soil needs to be covered with plants, and if it's not covered with plants, it needs to be covered in mulch. So the number one thing you can do to help your soil be healthy is to give it a mulch. And for perennial borders, where you've got perennial plants, maybe some shrubs and trees as well, but those perennial plants, a compost mulch is the absolute best thing. Avoid those awful landscape fabrics at all costs. They're really, really bad for your soil structure. And so go for a loose mulch, so compost mulch in perennial borders. If you've got any areas where it's just shrubs or trees, and perhaps they're growing through long grass, then it's useful to keep the grass away from the base of them while they're establishing, but use a wood chip mulch or a compost mulch is absolutely fine too. But keep it loose mulches rather than sheet mulches for best soil structure and best soil health. And of course, soil is full of all these wonderful microbes. A healthy soil is really, really alive, and all those microbes are forming these wonderful symbiotic relationships with our plants and are feeding our plants and keeping them in really good condition. So it is really important to look after the soil. And once you've got a wonderful, healthy garden, all these lovely, healthy plants are going to be very attractive to all sorts of wildlife. Our principle number 2 and 3 are sort of, I always think of as a couplet. And I'll just quickly go through these. The principle 2 is diversity. And I'm not just talking about diversity of plant species. I'm talking about diversity of plant form as well. So talking about trees, shrubs, and ground cover plants, as well as climbers to cover vertical surfaces, all different forms of plants, plants with big leaves, plants with little leaves. So diversity of form means you're going to be creating habitats for different types of insects generally, but other animals too. The more diversity you can get in there, the more different types of habitat you're going to be creating. Different types of animals would be welcoming into your garden. The other sort of diversity to think about is plant families. So different families of plants are beneficial for different types of insects. Some of them can be really quite specific about the plant families that they need, particularly insects in the larval stages, and we'll talk about this in detail later. Some of them have to have very particular families. So if you can look at the shapes of the flowers, it's often a clue as to what the plant family is. So all pea family flowers have a very similar shape, and all daisy family flowers have a very similar shape. So try and get lots of different flower types or plant families into your garden. And the sort of the couple that goes with diversity is abundant. If you've got diversity, it's fantastic. But to go with that, you need abundance too. So if you're going for lots of different plant families, as we talked about, with daisy family, pea family, don't just have one of them, have lots. If you're going to buy some Michaelmas daisy, don't just get one Michaelmas daisy, get 5 and try and sort of lift and divide them over the years so you have a massive Michaelmas daisy. Because again, they're going to be attracting all sorts of insects into your garden, and insects do love to have a bit of a gorge. They do love to have loads and loads of the same thing all at the same time, so that they can really spend a lot of time. They haven't got to go flitting about to other gardens trying to find another one of those plants they've got a taste for. If you can put loads and loads of it out, it'll give off a load of lovely smell for them. They'll come in and they can settle right down with all their mates and have a lovely feast. So go for abundance with those plants as well. Not always possible with trees and shrubs, of course, in gardens, but with your perennial plants, it's great to have really big masses of those different plants throughout the year. Okay, so we're getting into more of the specifics now. Let's take a look at some of the features. And yeah, there are particular features that all wildlife gardens are going to share. I'm going to try and draw out some of the different options for these different types of gardens that we've talked about and for different levels of gardening skill or wildness factor. And I've bunched up the features into 2 main groups. The first group is, again, it's quite foundational. The first thing you want to be thinking about in a wildlife garden is insects, because they form the base of many food chains, along with those healthy plants. Insects are really, really important. If you can get loads of insects, then you're going to attract all sorts of other types of animals too that have some good things to feed on in your garden. Insects are not just important for food, they're really important for keeping those pests in balance. So slug eggs are eaten by ground beetles. So it's really great to provide habitat for beetles if you've got a problem with slugs. Aphids are eaten by all sorts of different insects, hoverflies eat them, ladybirds eat them. So the more insects you can get into your garden, the more your system is going to get into balance. And we're trying to sort of, although gardens are never going to be a sort of full natural ecosystem, we are trying to think of the wildlife gardens in terms of a fully functioning system. So insects are one of the key parts of this piece, of this puzzle, for getting a garden that's in balance. We've got health there, we've got diversity there, and abundance, and we need now to think about extra bits we can put in to get these insects really thriving. And of course, pollination services I've put down there too. And the other thing to think about is that whole cycle. So nature works in these wonderful cycles, doesn't it? And a big part of that is insects and other invertebrates that recycle that dead organic material back into the soil and keep the plants fed with nutrients from the soil and keep that whole thing working really well. So it's really good to think about all these different types, all the different ways that we can help insects in our garden. And so it really is the secret to a thriving wildlife garden. So let's have a look at some of the things that we can do. This is going to be the biggest section of the talk. The most well known, of course, is plants for pollinators. And there are so many lists of plants for pollinators. There are loads of different organisations putting them out. There are loads of different blogs or articles online you can find that talk about lists of plants for pollinators. It can, for beginner gardeners, it can be a little bit overwhelming. There's so many different conflicting ideas about which plants are best for pollinators. I've added my own list to this. So one of the handouts that you can get, which I'll give you some details about how to access at the end of the talk, is a list of plants for pollinators through the year. But what I want to do here, rather than give you lists of plants right now, I'm going to teach you how to work out for yourself whether plants are good for pollinators, because there are a few common features that they all have. So if you go down to the garden centre and you're having a look at the plants and you want to get some that are good for pollinators, you need to remember these things. The first thing is to avoid flowers that are doubles, which means that they have many rings of petals instead of just a single ring of petals, and in the middle you have all the reproductive parts. You've got the stamen and the anthers, lovely fluffy little bits with all the pollen on in the middle. Instead of that middle bit, they've got extra petals, and that means that they haven't got the nectaries. Instead they've got all these petals. So you don't get double flowers. Double roses are not good for pollinators, but single roses are, with their lovely yellow fluffy middle. So avoid doubles. Look for plants with massed flowers. So I've got some pictures up on the screen here. You can see the lavender flowers there. On each of those flower spikes, you've got all those little purple blobs, they're individual flowers, and each of those has nectar in it. So on each spike, there are loads and loads of opportunities to get nectar. And over the whole bush, there's a massive nectar there. You can see the pink flower there is the phlox. And again, on that single flower spike that we can see, there are a whole load of flowers, and each one of those has got nectar in the middle of it. At the bottom, we've got a carrot flower. That's an umbelliferous flower, and umbels in the carrot family, things like parsley or carrots, or what else do we have? Cumin, coriander, all these lovely umbelliferous heads have loads and loads and loads of flowers all over them, and they're wonderful for all sorts of little beetles and hoverflies that can get in there and get all that nectar and spend a lot of time just on a single head, crawling around and getting all that lovely nectar out from those flowers. There are some flowers that have what's called a composite flower. So daisy family are one of these, where you have instead of having a single nectary, they've actually got absolutely loads and loads and loads. There are loads and loads of anthers, loads and loads of little fluffy heads, rather than a single ring of them. So on the one flower, if you've ever seen some echinacea, one of those lovely big sort of globes that you get in the middle of an echinacea plant in the daisy family, you can see a bee or a butterfly spending ages just on a single flower, getting all that nectar out of that single flower. So although they don't put up perhaps as many flowers as you get on a phlox plant, each of those flowers is really, really valuable. So And that's another type of flower that's really good to look out for. So you're thinking about how many nectaries you're going to get by looking at these massed flower effects or these composite flowers. The other thing to think about is diverse plant families. So as I mentioned a bit earlier on, you're looking at different flower shapes in different families. And those different flower shapes are suitable for different types of insects who have different shaped mouth parts. So if you can get as many different plant families in as possible, you're going to be providing nectar for many different types of insects. So do look for different plant families. And of course, get a nice spread through the year. So at each time of the year, spring, summer, and autumn in particular, you want to try and provide some nectar from a range of different plant families. And depending on the size of your garden, you'll be able to fit sort of more different plant families in if you've got a large garden, or just perhaps a few if you've got a smaller garden. But do try and provide something throughout the year. Yeah, I did want to ask about this actually, because I do tend to find that often, especially perhaps some of you that are more experienced, we do find that we've got particular plants that are really popular for bees or butterflies. And it's really one of the ways that you can find out about plants and pollinators is talking to your neighbours and finding out what's really working for them here in Shropshire, what's thriving in their soil, and what are the insects really enjoying. So I did want to give you an opportunity, any of you that do have some plants that are particularly good for you, it would be great to share some of that just for everybody to see in the chat. So if you do post it up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the list, but if anybody wants to have a little check, it'll be up there in the chat. Any top tips that anybody does have here for really great plants and pollinators. And I think you do have some people here who've got quite a lot of experience in the garden. So it'd be great if you can share any ideas with people, the plants that they can put in their gardens. As I say, there is a handout at the end as well, so I've given you some suggestions, but there's always more, and it is good to get some good local advice about what's really working here. Okay, well, while that's going on, let's move on to the next section, which is about native plants, trees and shrubs. Now, yeah, there's a lot of talk about, do we need to go native, or can we use any old garden plants? And when it comes to plants and pollinators, there isn't any need to go with native plants at all. There are so many cultivated garden plants or plants from around the world that we're growing in our gardens that are great for pollinating insects. It hasn't got to be native at all. However, when it comes to feeding often the larval stages of insects, we do find that it's very, very useful to have native plants, native shrubs and trees. I'm going to share just a few of those with you to give you some ideas of some of the native plants. It can be really useful to integrate into your garden. As I've mentioned already, when it comes to trees and shrubs, some of them can self-seed around, and it can be quite difficult to get rid of if that's happened. So I often recommend native trees and shrubs more for larger gardens where you can handle that sort of thing, or for people who are quite comfortable with a sort of wilder style of garden. But I would like to recommend there are some really good smaller plants that can work in any sort of a garden and are really useful to some of our sort of butterflies' larval stages in particular. I'm going to show you some of these next. So yeah, one of my favourite butterflies is the orange-tip butterfly. One of the early butterflies to come out. And the caterpillars of the orange-tip butterfly are very particular in the way that they feed. They have to have plants that are in the mustard family. So this is brassica plants, and two particularly lovely ones that we can keep in our gardens are Honesty, with its beautiful purple flowers, flowering now, it has been for a while. They're usually purple. You can get white varieties or sort of slightly orangey varieties. I've never been able to find a seed for that one, but there is a beautiful orange variety. But usually they come in this gorgeous pink. And of course they have their very distinctive sort of moon-shaped seed heads. Wonderful plants. And that's one for the caterpillars of the orange-tip butterfly. Also hedge garlic. Some people love it, some people aren't so keen. Also known as Jack by the hedge. Edible garlic flavoured leaves. And yeah, it's a very sweet plant. It's got very lovely in its leaf stage. Likes to go in shady places or sunny places, happy pretty much anywhere. Easy to weed out. Both these plants are very easy to weed out. Biennial plants, so they don't last for ages and ages. But where you leave them, they both look really beautiful. Hedge garlic, fairly subtle, but white flowers up at the top and nettle-like leaves. So those are great for the orange-tipped butterfly. The common peacock and red admiral, also small tortoise shell. All the butterflies in this family need nettles for their caterpillars. This isn't one for everybody, but if you have the size of garden that can handle a nettle patch, larger the better. Their caterpillars only feed on nettles, so they really do need them. So it's great for your local populations of these beautiful garden visitors if you can have a little patch of nettles somewhere. Another beautiful little butterfly, the small copper. This is a really small butterfly, really, really sweet, and it feeds on sorrel, which is a plant. Perhaps it's better for gardens where you can have a bit of rough grass or a little bit of meadow. So those of you that don't have space for that sort of thing or the inclination for that sort of thing, this perhaps isn't one for you. But if you do, it is a lovely plant to include in a meadow. It looks similar to a dock, but the leaves have an arrow-like shape at the base. So if you can see on those, the leaves that I've got there, instead of where the stem joins the leaf, instead of the shape of the leaf reaching away from the stem, it kicks back, these two little kickbacks. And that's how you tell whether it's a sorrel or a dock. The leaves, again, it's another edible plant, actually. The leaves taste very lemony. It's a very nice addition to salads or omelettes, chops or, but yes, very good for small copper butterflies. And another one is the common blue, which is one of my favourite butterflies. They have such a wonderful bright blue colour. And the caterpillars of blue butterflies need leguminous plants, so pea family plants to feed on. So good examples of these for the garden. Again, this is for a meadow garden, or somewhere you can have some long grass growing. Clover and bird's-foot truffle are both good plants for these. Those plants will grow through a lawn, but unfortunately you've got to let the lawn grow long. If you're cutting your lawn, of course, you're going to be clipping away bits of plant that the caterpillars might have been enjoying. So it's only for gardens where you can have some long grass. Now, the next feature for insects, a really important feature for all wildlife, in fact, is water. As ever, big is best. If you can get a big pond in, the bigger the better. You're going to be providing habitat for a wider range of insects, the larger you can go. Again, we're thinking of diversity again, so we're thinking diversity of shape. So we do want to have some nice tapering edges so that things can crawl out. Also, you can have some shallows for things to crawl in. You want a range of different depths for different types of plants, for different types of organisms. Ideally, you want to have a deep end that's at least sort of between 60 and 75 centimetres deep, perhaps more than that, so that it's not going to freeze solid in the winter time. The best for wildlife, the best sort of siting is thinking about putting it in full sun. So you've got some lovely sunlight shining onto the pond. And you do want to put in some really good plants to cover part of the water surface. You want some to be submerged in the water, and you want to have some nice marginal plants coming out at the edges. And I can recommend using native plants. There's a lovely plant nursery that I like to use called Waterside Nursery, who have, I recommend them just because they have a really easy to use website that separates out their plants into whether they're British natives or not. And they have really good information about plants for different sizes of ponds. They've got a big selection of plants for really tiny ponds that can be as small as a water bowl. And you can see there's a picture there of a water bowl towards the bottom of the screen. Even something as small as that is a beneficial habitat and is going to be of help within your garden. So go as large as you can, but even a small pond is really useful. Even if you can't fit a pond, a bird bath is a useful thing just to get some water in the garden, and insects will come to drink as well as birds. But if you can go any larger, I would definitely encourage you to do so. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about for insects is just remembering that overwintering season, and remember to give them somewhere to hide out during the winter. And there are so many different ways you can do this. Basically, you've got to provide lots of different crevices, lots of different hideouts, and different types of insects are going to want different types of hideouts. So I mentioned ground beetles earlier on, and it's good to encourage them to help with your slug problems. They, of course, are on the ground, so things like ground beetles are really going to benefit from piles of leaves, piles of sticks, some sort of garden debris is really great for them. Stone walls, piles of things really are very useful. So piles of stones are useful. Dry stone walls are really great. Log hotels are perhaps a better option if you've got a tidy garden than having piles of leaves and sticks. So you can buy some very beautiful ones if you've got a really nice, neat garden, and put them up in a sensible position, remembering that ground beetles crawl along the ground, but insects, flying insects, need something that's higher up. They're going to find little hidey holes that are, you wouldn't want to put this at ground level. You want it to be about 1 metre off the ground. They want some shelter, so they don't want to be facing towards the cold north and east winds. So do face it towards the south and west, and make sure that it's got a nice solid board at the back of it. You don't want the wind to go howling right through any hollow stems that you might put there. So you can see the little sort of house-shaped insect home there has got a nice solid back to it, and it's fixed strongly to what looks like a tree to keep it nice and secure for them through the winter. The natural version of this for slightly wilder gardens is to leave those winter stems up in your beds and borders. And it's definitely recommended to clear up those dead stems in the springtime. If you do need it to look neat, if you prefer to have a neat looking garden, and as I say, there are some fantastic plants that are being explored in prairie gardens. So rather than my teasel that I had in that previous shot, if you'd like a very beautiful garden full of winter stems, there are some garden designers at the moment. The most famous one is Pete Rudolph and also Noel Kingsbury. They both produce some wonderful books with all sorts of planting inspiration for this style of garden. And as I say, one of the main wildlife benefits of this type of gardening is these wonderful winter stems that we get. And all these pictures here show some good examples. The one at the top left there has some echinacea left standing through the winter, and they hold a really lovely structural shape. To the right of that, we've got those wonderful globe thistles, Echinops retro, which form beautiful sort of pom-pom shapes right through the winter. We've got some sedums at the bottom left there, and on the bottom right, Monarda, which has, again, the sort of slightly shaggy sort of globe-like heads that hold really nice and strongly right through the winter. The second of the handouts does give you my top plants that I would recommend for this style of garden if you'd like to try and integrate some of these into beds and borders. It's a really nice, beautiful bit of habitat for your overwintering insects. And the second section of the features that we're looking at, much, much briefer. The insects is really the big one to go for. Once you've provided homes for insects, you've provided food for larger animals and for birds. You've provided some water for your insects, so your animals and birds have got access to water as well. So really all that larger animals need, once you've provided all this stuff, is some shelter. So again, you can make your own, you can buy some ready-made ones, which are often really good options if you like to have a neater garden, or if you want to put something into a neater area of the garden. So there are all sorts of homes for hedgehogs. There are lovely bird houses. You can get some very stylish ones, or you can get some beautiful rustic ones. Or as I say, you can make your own. There's some excellent advice on siting these, building these, or on getting the right designs from the RSPB in particular. I find them really useful and some really fantastic information for you. So I do recommend having a little look on there, not just for bird homes, but for other types of homes too. More sort of natural options, I guess, are having piles of things, as I say, for the insects, piles of leaves, piles of branches are really great hideouts for the winter. But also think about your plant structure. So we talked about diversity of plant structure and thinking about different shapes and sizes. Trees, of course, make great places, great habitat for all sorts of things. But also large-leaved plants, so your rhubarbs and your hostas that have these wonderful, great big leaves and provide fantastic shelter for things like frogs to hide out and sort of wait for insects to pass them by. You often find them hiding out in the rhubarb patch. So yeah, really large leaf plants are great, or shrubs that have sort of cover right down to the ground where things can hide out. So think about using your plants creatively to create little hideouts around the garden. And that can work in any style of a garden. Of course, if you've got a really wild garden, you're going to have all sorts of scrub and plants all over the place, perhaps some tufty grasses, leaving all sorts of little habitats for mammals to make little runs beneath. But for the neater gardens, so lovely sort of clipped shrubs that provide nice dense cover are a really great alternative to that. And of course, the last thing we want to integrate into the garden is ourselves. We have to remember that these are gardens, and gardens are places where both we live and all those things that make up our garden. I really do like to think of them as this sort of interface between us and the wild. So really think about designing that into your garden as well, and thinking about where you fit into this system that is your wildlife garden. So think about the reasons why you might want to spend time in your garden, and think about what you might want to see while you're there. Think about what activities you might do. Might it be eating? Might it be reading the paper? Might it be taking phone calls, playing with the children? What things do you need, and where are you going to put them? What type of wildlife would you like to spend time with while you're doing those things? So create some nice sit spots around the garden. I find that I like to sit if I'm thinking about work or just want somewhere to get a clear head. I find I like to sit at the end of the garden where it's a little bit wilder and I can see a bit of a view. And I find that's a nice peaceful place for me to sit when I'm doing that sort of thing. Whereas if I've got a friend over for a coffee, then it's nicer to sit perhaps near some lovely butterfly planting where all the butterflies are flitting in and out. So it's really nice to sort of think about how you integrate into the environment and how you're going to get the maximum enjoyment from having all this wildlife coming to your garden. Think about what you want to notice at different times. And then when you're noticing these things, do find out what the names are of everything. If you're not brilliantly familiar with everything, I really urge you to get some good wildlife guides. There are some fantastic ones produced by the Field Studies Council that you can see on the top. These are my favourite selection from home. I pulled out for you and took a photo so you can see what I use. So I love these guys. The top left here, the 3 Field Studies Council guides, are really straightforward ones for beginners to have a look and try and work out some of the more common types of garden wildlife. And there are loads of different topics. They've got loads to choose from. But in-depth books are also great for getting a little bit more detail and finding a bit more about some background about the different things that you're finding. So do get into this and really sort of explore your garden wildlife and find out what's there. And then if you're doing that, I do encourage you to, I'm going to come back to this in a sec, I do encourage you to get involved with some of the monitoring schemes. With Stepping Stones Project is doing some fantastic work to help with wildlife, but something we can do as gardeners is we can find out what we've got in our gardens and we can record it. So a really great one that is being used by wildlife professionals in Shropshire to monitor the wildlife here is iRecord, which is something you can get as a smartphone app, or you can do it online. And it is for recording all different types of wildlife and plants. So you can pick your favourite ones, perhaps your favourite category, perhaps do butterflies or beetles, and record that on the iRecord app. Nature's Calendar is a lovely one used nationally, and they're recording, in particular, they're looking at climate change. So they're looking at seasonal events and how the seasonal events are gradually changing over the years, and they're monitoring these changes. Bird Track is another lovely one, specifically for birds. And again, it's got a really nice smartphone app you can use. And there are a couple of, well, there are a number of different ones you can join in with on particular days or particular times during the year. And it's a really nice thing to do all together. The Big Butterfly Count and the Big Garden Bird Watch are 2 that I would recommend to get involved with. I did put a quick question up, but I'm aware that we're quite short on time. So if you have any favourite wildlife guides, post them up for everybody to see. But otherwise, that's about it from me. I'm afraid I have been waffling on. So I've been talking for such a long time. So thank you everybody for listening in. If you would like to find out some more information, do get involved I'm setting up a gardening club supporting new wildlife gardens in Shropshire, which is called Shropshire Nature Gardens. So do get in touch with me about that if you would like to know more. I'm going to be helping gardeners around the county. In particular, I'd love to focus on the Stepping Stones area to help people get set up with new wildflower meadows and learning about all sorts of features for their gardens. So if you'd like to get involved, get in touch with me. Website details at the bottom. I do have some handouts that are made for you, so have a look on my website. If you go to my homepage and just into the address bar, type in /wildlife-gardening. I set up a page for you which has some handouts with plant recommendations. You can't access this from any of the menus, so you will need to type in that /wildlife-gardening to get those handouts. And of course, Charlie's garden visit, I definitely recommend going to have a look at this garden. It's a wonderful inspiration. Really lovely garden to see. Okay, I better stop talking there. Do we have any questions, Charlie? Do we have any time for it?
Yeah, I mean, if you have time, Nancy, then we've got a few questions.
I'm happy to stay and answer some questions.
Brilliant. Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions around ponds and water features. So they're sort of linked really. So the first one is how to get rid of non-natives. I presume that's plants without losing all the wildlife. And sort of another one related, how to get rid of duckweed, or if you need to get rid of duckweed, is that a problem, and how to do it. So a couple on on ponds, if that's okay to start with.
Yeah, so the non-native plants, that's in non-native plants in ponds, is it?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Go on. Okay, yes, it can be tricky to get rid of plants in ponds. It depends on the scale of the ponds that we're dealing with. So I wonder if whoever asked that question can give us a little bit more detail about the size of the pond. But yeah, there's nothing, you can't use any sort of chemical treatment or anything like this, obviously, in a pond. So it's literally a case of having to get in there, get a good set of waders if it's a big pond, and just keep at it, just keep taking that plant back. Any plant will fail to survive if you keep taking the leaves off it. So if you keep on taking it back and taking it back, you're going to keep it under control at the very least. Depending on what the plant is, it may be very difficult to eliminate, or it may be that if you keep knocking it on the head, you'll find that it just gives up the ghost and the problem is solved. So yes, I'm afraid it is going to be quite a lot of work just to keep on top of that. Duckweed can be a tricky one. I'm afraid this isn't my area of specialism, so I'm not going to be able to give you any definitive answers to this one. But yeah, again, I would recommend that you just keep at it, sort of trying to get rid of it, but also that you try and make sure that you've got a good diversity of different types of plants in your pond. So try and make sure that you're not leaving too much of the pond surface open to the sun. Get some good plants that provide floating leaves, like water lilies. There are lots of other types of plants as well that provide those sort of floating plants. So there's not too much sun getting into the pond. And also keep a good range of other types of plants. So you're going to need floating leaf plants, you're going to need submerged plants that go right under the water, and you're going to need some marginal plants. So get a good diversity of different types of plants in different types of places, and you will help to bring the sort of structure of the planting under control. But I'm sure there's more advice that other people could give you about duckweed in particular. It's not one that I've ever had to deal with, I'm afraid. So I would advise you to also look elsewhere to get some more tips on that, and I'm sure you can find out some more too. Okay.
And someone asking if you could share the picture or a plan of the big bug hotel that you showed earlier on in the presentation. Have you got any more
Oh,
details on that?
yeah, is that the one, the little house one that I had up on the presentation? That was the bug hotel, wasn't it? Yes, how can I share this? I can post that up onto the same web page if that's helpful, so that people have got access to it there. It was a lovely one. There are so many different ways that you can make up bug hotels. It's all about creating little tunnels for insects to hide out in over winter. So that particular one had some little drilled posts. So literally it's just pieces of wood with little holes drilled into it. And it also had some areas with pine cones in and some little bits of just debris. You can put little sticks or little twigs in and into a little sort of bunched area, and it provides spaces where some things can hide out. And of course, hollow stems can be put into these things too. It makes a lovely sort of mosaic pattern to get creative with putting all different types of hollow situations into a frame. That wasn't one that that was a DIY one rather than one that you can buy in a shop. But there are all sorts of beautiful ones that you can buy ready-made as well, from the shops, from garden centres and such places. Yes, I'll see if I can post up a picture for that.
Great, thanks. Someone's recommending for hay fever sufferers, try female holly. The recommendation there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, that's really good to know for us hay fever sufferers.
And some other suggestions for dealing with slugs. Someone saying sheep's fleece is a good barrier, but this person hasn't tried it yet. This is from Richard. Hi, Richard. He hasn't tried it yet, but has heard it's a good barrier.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Yes, yes, I've not used raw sheep's fleece myself, but I've also heard that's a really good barrier. And I know that you can get sheep's wool pellets from the garden centre, which I have used, which for some are easier to get hold of. They're just little brown pellets that you scatter in a circle around vulnerable plants like delphiniums or hostas as they're coming up, and that does work very well to stop the slugs crawling over to your plants. So yeah, barriers are really good. I use bramble clippings. I've had any brambles that I've been clipping back and they've gone all, I've still got the stems, they've gone all brown, they're very prickly. I cut them into little sections and use those in a ring around some of my plants, and that works very well too. It's thinking of things that are going to feel uncomfortable for slugs to crawl under. So yes, that's one of my favourites.
And a sort of two-pronged question on compost, really. Firstly, if you have any tips on how to make a good compost, and secondly, obviously everyone's very keen to try and avoid peat in compost, quite rightly. So, have you got any tips about sort of alternatives to peat-based compost?
Okay, yeah. So, compost, making your own compost. Yes, there's a few things you can do that will make it more successful. One of them, you need to make sure that you're mixing green and brown materials. So green materials are your nice sort of leafy materials. This can include flowers as well as leaves. It's a very soft sort of sappy materials. And brown materials are more sort of hard, kind of woody materials. So your plant stems and any sort of twiggy woody bits. So it's good to have a mixture of those two things so it doesn't go too soggy. You don't want to put lots of grass all in at the same time because it will be very, very soggy and start to stink anaerobic. You need to mix that up with other things. Green and browns, it's also a really good idea to chop up your materials. So if you're doing it, perhaps springtime, you're clearing down your beds and borders and you've got lots of those old plant stems, it's a really good idea to chop them up as you go. They will break down that much more quickly and they're that much easier to sort of mix into your other materials if you've got it nicely chopped. The other thing that can really help is just to turn it regularly. So if you have the time for this, I would recommend turning your heap several times a year. So 2 or 3 times will do the job. If you can do more than that, then it's going to become compost much more quickly. And this really does make a difference. While you're turning it, you can be checking if it's moist enough. So if you're not turning it at all, you'll find that there'll be lots of material in there that's getting quite dry. As you're turning it, if you're finding dry sections, make sure you've got a watering can with you as you turn and water it as you go. You don't want it to get really, really soggy, so you're not getting it so that if you pick up a handful, it's going to be dripping when you squeeze it, but it does want to be moist. And then it wants to be packed back down again. So you haven't got big air pockets They're all the time thinking about the microbes that are there. Microbes are like all other organisms. They need moisture, they need fresh air, they need food, and they need shelter. They need all the same things as the rest of us. So they want some air, but so you don't want to compact it so it's completely solid, but they don't want such massive air pockets. They haven't got access to all the food and all the moisture. They've got these big open gaps. So yeah, so I tend to, if I'm looking after big compost heaps in a big bay, then I tend to actually trample on it. I get in there and stand on it as I'm going, and then layer up the next layer, water it, stand on it again. Because that's enough. There's still air gaps in there, but that's as much as it takes to kind of stop it having these massive air gaps. That can be a real problem and cause it to dry out. So do all those things, and yes, you should find that you get some wonderful compost. At the end of it, do keep rotating it as you go. That is a really big one. And then when it comes to peat-free, yes, it's fairly straightforward to find bagged peat-free compost now. The difficult thing to find is the John Innes blends that are peat-free. So John Innes is when you've got some loam material in there rather than just pure organic matter. So these are really good for potting mixes and for seed mixes, where you really do need some loam to help with the moisture retention and for the mineral content of the compost. Pure organic matter composts are great as mulches. And good peat-free examples include the Silver Grow, which I'm tending to see in lots of different garden centres at the moment, made by Melcourt, and this is made from recycled or reused, I guess, composted bark shavings from the timber industry. So it's a really lovely one to go for. It's fantastic for perennial beds and borders. Lovely, soft, it's a really good peat alternative. It's very moisture retentive, and it's a lovely, soft, easy to use compost. There are a number of other brands as well that are doing pure peat-free composts. However, if you're potting or if you're growing seeds, you do need a more loam-based compost. So the John Innes are ones that do these loam-based composts. These tend to have peat in, and you have to read the small print. You've got to really read everything on the back of the compost bag to find the bit where it says it's got peat in. So it's quite difficult to source those. So I recommend that you make your own, and it's very straightforward to do this. You just need to get either your homemade compost, or you get one of those lovely peat-free 100% organic matter composts like the Silver Grow, and you mix this with some soil and some sharp sand. The proportions of these things don't matter too much. You can go pretty much equal, all of those things. You can mix it up depending on what you have to hand. The thing that makes it a seed compost or a potting on compost is the amount of nutrients that has been added to the compost. This is the biggest difference. So the potting composts have added nutrients. So if you're trying to garden organically, you need to be aware that potting composts, John Innes number 2, number 3, have got nutrients added to them. If you want to mix it yourself, then you can put in your own organic nutrients. You can use a fish blood and bone to go into there, or you can use your lovely live compost, which is incredibly nutritious, and mix that with some soil and with some sharp sand, horticultural sharp sand. And I recommend looking for somewhere with molehills for your soil. I go down to the field next to me and get some molehill soil. It's a wonderful way to make use of the moles. And it's great soil. It's always really nice and friable. So if you happen to have any moles nearby, it's a nice reason to feel that that's a good thing rather than an annoying thing. Otherwise, try and find some soil from your beds that you can mix in with it. If you can't get hold of it in any soil, then at the very least do put some horticultural sharp sand in some compost, and that will make a better potting compost than just compost on its own. So I hope that's helpful to whoever was asking that question.
Great, thanks, Nancy. I'm sure we could talk on that. It's absolutely fascinating. I want to get out into the garden right now and do stuff. But it is 5 minutes to 9. So I think unless anyone else has any burning questions to very quickly type into the chat, I think we'll probably draw things to a close. But look out for a follow-up email. So I will send that out in the next few days, and that will have links to various things that Nancy's mentioned, like her handouts. It'll have details of that garden visit on the 5th of July. And also, as part of Stepping Stones later on this summer, we will be doing a bit of a trial project, really. a gardening project linked to increasing the diversity of road verges and local meadows. So we'll be looking for people who want to have a go at helping us harvest some wildflower seed and growing on plug plants, which we can then plant out when they're ready into local road verges and meadows. And you can probably keep some for your own lawns as well. So yes, there'll be details of that in the follow-up email as well, and how you can stay involved with the Stepping Stones project. So just want to say a huge thank you to Nancy, really. It's been really fascinating, as I said, and yeah, I'm just so happy that you've taken the time out of your busy schedule, Nancy, to talk to us this evening. So yeah, huge thank you.
Thank you, Lou. My pleasure. It's been fun.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all for attending, and I will be in touch, as I say, over the next few days, and happy gardening.